Welcome to the Dare to Know podcast. I'm your host, Fabian Korver. Today, we are joined by Ian Werkheiser. Ian Werkheiser is an associate professor in the Department of Philosophy at the University of Texas Rio Grande Valley and the director of the Center for Collaboration and Ethics at UTRGV. His research is currently focused on how communities of resistance address environmental harms and hazards, particularly around food, while also dealing with social and political oppression or marginalization. He's particularly interested in the ways that UTRGV can become an anchor institution in the Valley and benefit those communities of resistance. In today's conversation, we will be focusing on the topic of local food and the variety of sub-movements within local food. I hope you enjoy the episode. The Dare to Know podcast is now also available on iTunes and Spotify. Please check out the links in the description below. Professor Werkheiser, welcome to the Dare to Know podcast.
Thank you. I'm delighted to be here.
Yeah, thank you so much for being here. So maybe to start off, could you just tell us a bit about your journey? How did you get interested in sort of the philosophy of food and food studies more broadly?
Sure. So in one sense, I started thinking about these kinds of issues long before I was an academic or anything. You know, when I was 9 years old, my babysitter left a copy of PETA magazine out on her coffee table. And I have a lot of problems with PETA nowadays, actually, which maybe we can get into. But at the time, I flipped through it and I saw pictures of how animals were slaughtered, chickens and things in high capacity factories. And I then and there said, oh, well, that seems unacceptable. And so I told my mom that now I'm a vegetarian. And my mom, of course, said, no, because she had multiple children and wasn't going to start making me special meals. And also, like most Americans, was convinced that, protein is this magical animal substance. And if I'd started being vegetarian at 9, I would still be that height today, And so I said, well, yes, I am. You can't force me. And she said, I don't know what to tell you. That's not what the food is at our house. And so I held out just eating like pasta noodles if she made spaghetti meatballs, or just like bread and cheese and lettuce if she made hamburgers, for about 6 months, which I think is a ridiculously long time for a 9-year-old to stick with anything, and then gave up until I went away to college. So I was already kind of thinking about food in that sense. And then also, I grew up in Northern California, and my family spends a lot of time in West Marin, which is an area just like north of San Francisco. And despite the fact that it's very close to San Francisco, which is one of the hottest housing markets in the world, there are still lots of ranches and farms, and it's a very sort of rural life. And the reason why is because of the Marin Agricultural Land Trust, which is this land trust organization that holds farming lands and ranching lands in usufruct, meaning that they technically own it, but the ranchers can do whatever they want to it as long as it's being used to produce food. If they try to turn it into condos or vacation homes, and they lose access to the land. And so, I grew up in sort of with a lot of time spent in these sort of semi-rural areas, and only semi-rural because of explicit value commitments that the community had and policies that they had set up in order to enact that. And again, malt has its own problems. But these sorts of backgrounds already had me thinking about those things. And, I was really interested in sort of social justice focused, progressive kind of politics, as well through college. And that all kind of came together when I was doing my graduate studies in philosophy, because it let me, I'm always thinking about food. And what I sort of discovered is, at least for me, food is a way to touch on all of these kinds of issues that I'm interested in, about community sustainability, about policy and its effects on the environment, about social justice, about our duty towards non-human animals, all sorts of things like that come together around this nexus of food.
That's really fascinating. And so what were sort of the initial questions that you were struggling with? I know you wrote quite a few articles about local food, but was that also where you started, or could you tell us a bit about that?
Yeah, sure. So when I was first starting to do this in a more academic kind of way, other than my interest in non-human animals, just sort of like one unrelated stream, the other was thinking about non-hierarchical relationships, community-focused kind of justice issues, critiques of sort of the dominant politically liberal sort of a society that we live in, sort of a thing, through food. And so a lot of that is going to be thinking about community food production and sustainability. Also, I'll say that, two people that I worked with a lot at Michigan State where I was getting my PhD. Paul Thompson is very well known for working on sustainability issues, on rural life and farming. And Dr. Kyle White, who's now at University of Michigan, but was at Michigan State at the time, he's an Indigenous scholar and does a lot of work on traditional knowledge of Indigenous peoples. And so, because of that kind of influence from those great guys, it helped me sort of focus in those questions on rural sustainability, production, how is food actually produced, thinking about it as a thing that is, sort of exists throughout an entire chain. We often think about food as, most of us, as something that we eat, right? Because that's the only interaction we have with it. But if you think about food throughout its entire chain from production through disposal, including distribution and all those sorts of other steps along the way, I think you get a much sort of richer picture. The other reason that I thought about local food a lot initially is because I'm from Northern California. And being from Northern California, we can get into this when we talk about local food a little bit, but there's a lot of people who are well-intentioned and would like to, think of themselves as good people and do good things. But it also, partly because of, changes in income and how much money people have, the mechanism for doing that is, thinking about what they can buy, right? So, recycling is very big there. Hybrid cars are very big there. That sort of thing of showing who you are through your purchases. And so local food, of course, is something that they talk about quite a bit. So that kind of juxtaposition of the way wealthy consumers were thinking about local food and the way that farming communities, I did some projects interviewing farmers in Michigan while a PhD student think about local food. Those sorts of two ways of interacting kind of drove a lot of the initial work that I was doing.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting. And, we've been talking a bit about local food also with Professor Borghini. That was really focused on sort of the ontology of food, but maybe just taking sort of the historical picture of like how we should be thinking about local food, because obviously there's different ways how people think and approach the question of local food. So what's the history there? Like, how should we think from a historical perspective about sort of how local food as sort of a concept emerged?
Sure. Well, in one sense, the history of local food is just the history of food, because for thousands of years, you wouldn't talk about local food. You would just talk about food, parentheses, almost all the food I've ever experienced is local, right? Except for maybe traded stable commodities like spices. Everything else was local food. And so that wasn't really a problem, right? People didn't think about that at all. What people thought about was issues like famine, right? And getting enough food. There was and also, by the way, what people were thinking about, if you're thinking about people getting enough food, that's consumption. Mm-hmm. Production, on the other hand, farmers are thinking about getting enough money for food, right? Mm-hmm. This is going back to the work of Amartya Sen. He's an economist, but I like him anyway. And he talked a lot about people being able to sustain their lives, right? Of having this sort of basket of capabilities of sustaining their lives. And for people who work a job in a city, for example, for them, lower prices of food make their lives more sustainable, right? Because they can eat more easily, they can sustain themselves in that way. And then also then they have other money for the other things that they need. Yep. If you're a farmer, higher prices of food make your life more sustainable, because then you can purchase things that you need for your own life, because you can sell the food that you produce at a premium. Mm-hmm. So there's kind of like this, I don't want to say irreconcilable, but there's a tension that always exists in distribution of food. The cheaper food is, you're helping some people, the more expensive it is, you're helping some other people. And there were food riots for hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of years, all those sorts of things. The solution to that a lot of governments and other institutions saw was through assuring a minimum price for food for farmers, right? So the government will buy it, and then distributing it, right? So school lunch programs, food stamps in the United States, which is sort of a very American thing we can talk about if you want, but direct distribution of food in various institutions, even to prisons and hospitals and things like that also count. So that, they're trying to equalize these two prices. So, and of course, distributing it to countries that don't have food, because maybe there's a country where there's a shortage of food right now. We can purchase it from our farmers at a higher rate than the people from that country ever possibly could, thereby sustaining the farmers in our country, and then we'll give it to them. That was the idea. There's a lot of problems with that, but that's the general idea. So it's all distribution questions. So those distribution questions from well-intentioned people are pushing us towards more linked kind of food systems. At the same time, just the natural processes of capitalism are, I say natural, but the processes of capitalism are consolidating commercial distribution of food, larger and larger grocery chains, larger and larger farms, corporate-owned farms, as much as the government allows hierarchical or vertical monopolies between, grocery stores controlling farms to the extent that they can, or distributors controlling producers, that sort of thing, and just kind of making it into a big system. And as that happened, people started to notice, right? Mm-hmm. And so part of the pushback in the 1960s and 1970s in particular was trying to get away from that whole thing. And there was, there's the Back to the Land movement, but in general, people were just trying to resist what they saw as these corporate sort of decisions that are bad. Maybe they're bad for the environment if they're using pesticides. Maybe they're bad for workers, depending on how the grocery stores are paying things. All these sort of things, it seems generally bad, right? As the culture shifts happened in the 1960s and 1970s. And then one possible response to that was eating locally, right? Yep. Connect with the farmers that you have around you. Farmers can make much more money selling directly to you than they can to a grocery distributor. And you can, in theory, pay less than you were at the grocery store, although sometimes you pay a premium just to help the farmers even more, right? But still, that kind of direct connection seems to help that. Maybe we can encourage local food production I'll set aside the idea of doing that as a response to famine in poor countries, because that's one of the papers that we're going to talk about discusses. But the idea is that, you want to learn about the food. You want to relearn about seasonality. Your grandparents knew that you would get strawberries at one time of year, but not all of the year. And that was something to celebrate. Maybe we can reconnect to this. Dr. Thompson, I was just mentioning him at Michigan State, one of my mentors. He wrote a lot about, in the spirit of the soil, this idea of having a connection to the land around you. And, Wendell Berry, lots of people wrote about that. So that's kind of there were several things pushing towards local food, issues of social justice, issues of the environment, issues of just wanting some kind of like a reconnection to community, as community felt like it was increasingly under attack. We were increasingly turning into sort of neoliberal individual agents in a market, and people were hearkening back. They're yearning for something more connected, and farmers market seemed like the kind of way to do that. So that's kind of that's a little bit about the background of local food. And now it's continued to be a big thing. If you go to Walmart right now, one of the Walmarts that has, a grocery store inside of it, they will happily, many of them tell you that the food is produced locally, depending on where you're living. They might even have pictures of the farmers and the farm that produced it. They'll say, these apples or this wheat or this whatever was grown by this guy. Look, you can look at a picture of him. Here's the name of his farm. Here's how many miles away it is. So local food has been taken on in a big way by many sort of sectors of our society.
Mm-hmm. That's very interesting, and I think also you just mentioned sort of like the food miles, for example. That was also when I was talking in a previous episode to Professor Borghini. He was sort of re-evaluating, is that sort of the standard that we should be looking at in order to sort of clarify this idea of local food, where then he sort of started introducing the idea of a social conception of local food, and really re-evaluating sort of the ontology of food, and allowing us to understand how we should understand this term of local food. And I think he also put that under the sort of the term conceptual engineering, like trying to reconceptualize what is it really what we're trying to say when we say this concept. So there's a lot there, I guess. So we will be unpacking a lot during this conversation, but maybe just to make a start there, besides sort of this idea of local food, you also introduce this concept maybe as part of sort of an even broader, more all-encompassing sort of concept, which you term a regenerative food system. I hope I pronounced that correctly. So how do we now take this term of local food, which is already, I guess, quite a loaded term itself, and then connect it in this sort of broader idea?
Sure. And so I'll say that the concept of that the regenerative food system isn't originally mine. Kenneth Dahlberg and other people have written on that quite extensively. I can talk for hours about sustainability, so I'll try to just say enough, and you tell me if I need to say more about it. But regenerative food systems is sort of a response to the sustainability question, because much like how local food can be conceived of as literally a mathematical question of miles, or it can have, but that seems like missing in some ways. It seems like you've missed the point, right? Like, well, that's not why I wanted it. so what is 100 miles and not 105 miles? What does that give me? I mean, maybe it gives you some things, if you don't want to use a lot of fossil fuel for transportation, for example, but that isn't why a lot of people are interested in local food. And so, people try to grab some other terms. Likewise with sustainability. Sustainability is one of those things that initially sounds very good, but it can be met at the letter of the law in sometimes, depending on how you define the term, in ways that doesn't capture the spirit of what people care about when they say that they want something to be sustainable. If sustainable just means something can be continued into the future for a period of time, I mean, it's going to be a finite period of time. The sun is, you wouldn't say my garden is unsustainable because the sun will someday expand and swallow up the earth, right? Right. Well, all right, that's too long of a time scale. All right, well, great. So if I get to set the time scale, then, burning fossil fuels is sustainable because it's going to it'd be very hard to stop at this point. In fact, it's going to keep going for many years. How many years? That's a good question, but certainly next year. That we don't want to say burning fossil fuels is sustainable. That's not capturing what I care about. And so one response that some people have tried to do, like Dahlberg and others, is to talk about, let's think about a regenerative food system rather than something that's merely sustained. So something that, it sort of evokes an idea of it healing itself, of it, it feels organic. It's something that's growing. And so this idea of a regenerative food system explicitly by the people who first theorized it brings in questions of community, of participatory justice, of recognition justice, of distributive justice, so that people who are participating in a regenerative food system are helping the environment, they're helping non-humans around them in various ways you want to define that. Also, their communities are getting healthier. They're not disincluding some people in order to just have this lovely thing, but rather it's, growing and expanding and bringing more people into this. So, it has to be like environmentally friendly, but also ethical and equitable, right? The three E's, as Dahlberg has said, right? He's also talked about the importance of bringing in indigenous knowledge and that kind of thing. So the idea here is that at its best, local food would be a part of this sort of like wider concept of sustainability, read as something that is good, right? Rather than saying, Egyptian slave agriculture was arguably very sustainable. This isn't my point. That's Dr. Paul Thompson again. Arguably, Egyptian slave agriculture was super duper sustainable. But when people say we want a sustainable food system, presumably they aren't advocating returning to that. And so this is why people are trying to use other terms.
No, that's very interesting. And one thing that I noticed is ultimately like, simple questions maybe, of food ultimately lead you very quickly to sort of like the political and moral dimensions. And even there, I guess that's your point there, right? Even if we reach like sort of a perfect notion of sustainability, it might still not really say what we are really trying to aim at, or like the spirit that we're trying to capture. So in some sense, it's also like a balancing act, I guess, within all these subdisciplines of food in order to sort of get a picture together. And I guess that emphasizes what some of the guests on the podcast have been saying, namely that is really sort of an interdisciplinary sort of a project, right? Like really trying to get knowledge and information from these different areas. So no, that's really interesting. And then maybe going a bit deeper into this concept of local food. So you really wrote a great article or co-wrote it, if I'm correct, about local food. And there you sort of try to pull apart these different sort of sub-movements within the idea of local food. So just sort of to set them out. So, you discuss the individual focused sub-movement, the systems focused sub-movement, and then the community focused sub-movement. And then sort of before diving into all these, separate sort of sub-movements, you sort of raised the topic, I guess, before we enter sort of these questions regarding these different sub-movements, we should think about the connections between the self, political structures, and definitions of food. So maybe you could say a little bit about sort of these three different ideas before we then start evaluating these different sub-movements.
Sure. Yeah, I'll talk a little bit about it, but I think it'll be so I'll say something confusing right now, and then it'll become clearer when we actually, work through an example. But this is from a couple of papers that I've worked on, a book chapter and an article with Dr. Samantha Knoll, who's currently at Washington State and working on an interesting book, in fact, about some food movements. But the idea here is that, you mentioned conceptual engineering as an important sort of thing that philosophers do. And it's true, right? Philosophers, one of the tools in our toolkit is when we hear people using the same word, we like to sort of get under the hood and look at the engine that's driving the use of that word. And often, people who are using the same word have very different sort of ontological structures. They have very different concepts of what there is around us that those words are referring to. And that can lead to a lot of problems because people can think they're agreeing with each other when they're actually profoundly disagreeing with each other, or vice versa. They can actually basically agree, but they're using different words that they think they have to fight. And so, this is one of the things we like to do is be mechanics, and take a look at how the car actually runs rather than talk about the color of it. And in these different movements of local food, all of them would probably agree with a statement like people should eat locally or something like that, or people should be able to eat locally maybe. But what they think of when they're talking about people, what they think of when they're talking about local, what they think of, all of these sorts of things are actually quite different. To pick an example that we aren't going to talk about, but just sort of maybe as an illustration, if you think about the rise of obesity in the Western world, if you think of, so people are getting more obese, if you think of people as individual rational actors in a market system, right? So sort of the Homo economicus kind of vision of humans, then to the extent that eating a caloric surfeit and gaining weight is irrational, then they must be doing that because they have bad information. They're making market choices and something in the market is distorting their choices. They're making choices that aren't good for them. And so what we need to do is fix that, right? That's the intervention point. And sure enough, you see lots of policies saying that, McDonald's has to list how many calories are in its hamburger. And, we need to have, the green, yellow, red system in EU products, right? Of like saying how good something is, right? Because maybe it's just too much information. And even though we're rational actors and very, very smart, we're directing our attention elsewhere rationally, perhaps, to our job or something. So let's just give them a light and they can say, oh, I'll buy the green light stuff, right? So if that's the way you think about people, then that follows naturally. If, on the other hand, you think of obesity as a public health crisis, right? So it isn't that individual people are making choices, but rather populations are having a predictable effect based on, let's say, there's lots of ways you could go with this. You could say it's based on policy, or it's based, well, let's say it's based on particular things that are in the environment, right? So because there are too many sugary kinds of sodas, when that is present in the environment, you'll find at a population level that calorie intake goes up and obesity goes up. Okay, great. So then what we ought to do is ban sodas. So now we're not talking about giving people information. We're talking about making a policy decision. And New York State tried to do that, or New York City tried to do that with not great results. And but there's lots of other ways you could think about it too, right? There's lots of people who spend a lot of time in fat studies thinking about other ways we can conceive of people, right, as members of a community. Are we thinking of them as bodies, right? How are we thinking about food, right? In both of the ones that I just gave you, I was thinking about food just as calories, right? But obviously there's a lot to be said about cultural meanings of food, right? And all of those are going to give you kind of different ways to intervene, and likewise with local food. So the ontological structure underneath the assumptions you're making when you say people, in this case, right, and food, people are eating too much food, right? Is going to give you very different intuitions. And so even though you all agree with the same sentence, your proposed intervention points are going to be wildly different.
Yeah, no, that's interesting because it starts indeed like a very simply structured sort of sentence, but there's a lot there to unpack. So I guess now, okay, let's keep those things in mind. Then we'll start sort of with the first sub movement that you discussed, which is sort of focused on the individual. You got the individual focused sub movement, and obviously, I'm not obviously, I guess, but you mentioned, right, that this is sort of the main topic of discussion in sort of mainstream media. When people talk about local food, it usually is focused on this sort of conception of local food. So maybe you could just briefly introduce what is this conception, and obviously it's about the individual, but maybe, okay, how does that sort of is perceived in these terms of what a person is, what we just talked about, and then maybe also just introduce a few arguments that have been put forward by people that sort of participate in this sub-movement, where they think, yes, there's a strong argument to be made here that we should be supporting this movement.
Sure. So the idea with the individual-focused sub-movement of local food, so we're thinking of people as individuals, right? Sort of, again, like I was saying before, is individual people who make choices in a marketplace based on consumption. We're also thinking about people as consumers of food. Farmers are mentioned in this focus, but sort of as like a background condition, like trees or something. So, the individuals aren't farmers; they're people who buy food. And the idea is that people buy food and they eat it, and they ought to buy local food. It has lots of good advantages. And so you'll talk about all these sorts of advantages that it might have, right? So if people started buying more local food, well, that would keep money circulating in the local economy longer, rather than being concentrated at, in international conglomerates of, whatever grocery distributors. So that's good for local economies, arguably. It will sustain farming, which is a way of life that many people think is valuable and not to be sustained. You can only do that by purchasing from local farmers, because there's too many other, if you live in an industrial country anyway, there's so many forces trying to push farmers out and being unable to participate, selling their farm to large corporations, that you can support smaller, family farms. That's good. It is better for the environment because distribution is, less intensive. You're not bringing in hothouse strawberries from south of the equator in the winter and flying them into the United States, but rather you're buying something that was grown locally. And so somebody just drove it in a pickup truck a few feet. I mean, there's problems with all of these. I'm too aware of the critiques, but, so like sometimes one strawberry being flown is actually less bad if uses less per strawberry, if you want to think about it that way, than being driven in a pickup truck, but whatever. So we'll assert that that's just true, because this is the way people describe the movement. It connects you to seasonality. It connects you to the world around you. It makes you more aware of what sort of climate you live in, like your personal home, what food is around you, what are some local delicacies. Connects you to the local varieties of apples in your area. If you're from the United States, that's a thing that Michael Pollan likes to talk about a lot. So it has all of these knock-on benefits that are great, that come just from people making these choices to buy local food, right? That will create farmers markets. Restaurants will start to respond to that, that sort of pressure, and start to carry more of it, right? That it has all of these great effects. And the best part about it is you don't need to make any kind of like complicated legal fight against powerful corporations or anything. All you need to do is convince people about the value of local food. And in many ways, the argument goes, local food sells itself, because, it's yummy to eat things that have been recently picked, and it's nice to meet farmers and go to farms. And so, it's not a big fight. It's just like sort of a cultural shift. And if you can have this cultural shift, then you get all of these great benefits. That's sort of the individual focused model.
And I think you just already referred to it a bit earlier in the conversation, but you also talk about this phenomena. Just a concrete example of that would be sort of the farm to table phenomena, or sort of the political way of putting it, I guess, like voting with your fork.
Exactly.
So maybe if you could elaborate a little bit more, okay, this is one movement, how that was actually expressed, and I guess, what did they achieve?
Sure. So the idea here is farm to table is sort of a catchphrase, a brand, I guess, if you like, of saying that restaurants in particular, but other people have now taken it on, will have a direct connection with a farmer, give them more money. It'll be somebody local, someone that they know, and that food will then get brought to the table that you're eating at the restaurant and prepared in this really nice way. It'll cost more money probably, but it supports all of these sorts of local people and the relationships in this community that they're building, right? So restaurateurs previously wouldn't have known any of the farmers that live near them. They just know some truck that drives up and drops off stuff that they ordered in bulk from a catalog. So you're not only supporting individual people, but you're supporting making your town and your community more sort of enthusiastic. How are you more connected? How are you doing that? By eating there, right? So the individual here is viewed not only as one individual, who's making choices, but specifically as a consumer, right? So the way that you are electing for the kind of world you want to see is through your purchases, right? So that by buying something, you are sort of enacting the world that you want to have, right? You're showing people, this is what I want. That's the sort of price signal that you're sending. And people will respond to that in a rational, efficient market by giving people the thing that they say that they want. And so that, by voting with your dollars, by voting with your fork, by what you just choose to eat, you do sort of like build all of these individual sort of local things. I mean, this is all very, you've interviewed Noam Chomsky. So I'm giving this in the best possible light, but obviously there's a lot of critiques of a lot of what I just said.
Yeah. No, for sure. But I mean, I think for everyone, it sort of becomes obvious, like when you say, right, you sort of vote with your fork, and I guess that sort of translates in, you're voting with your purchasing power, right?
Exactly.
Like that seems to have sort of this economic lens all over it. And the question is that the only lens that's at play, or are we missing something? Although you do also mention, right, that like you can situate this sort of individual focused movement within a broader view of sort of liberal political philosophy. So there, I suppose you do get the hope. Oh no, there is more. Of course, like the economic lens isn't just that. So how do we situate this sort of individual focused sub movement within this broader view of political philosophies that have been quite dominant?
Yeah, well, so the idea would be that my eating local food is part of, still in this movement, is part of my vision of a good life, right? That's how I want to raise my kids. I want them to get out in the garden, get their feet dirty, to learn the life cycle of plants, not just to see that, not to think that blueberries come from a grocery store, but rather blueberries come from blueberry bushes, right? So this is my vision of how I want the world to be. And a good, well-run liberal state will allow people to pursue their visions of the good, right? And the problem, under this lens, is that that's very difficult right now. That this vision of the good is convincing to lots of people. That's part of the claim, or I can convince them if you read my book or watch my thing or whatever people say. But they're unable to do that because of market forces and things that are sort of perverting our ability to do that. And so, to the extent that there's like a political activist kind of edge to this movement, it's to stop people from making it difficult for people to pursue their vision of the good. As we then use normal liberal means of democratic participation and convincing and discourse, and I can just convince you that this is a nice way to live, and I can show you because I'm happy and I can give you reasons, then you'll also start to adopt that. If you don't want to, that's fine, right? So this kind of sub-movement wouldn't say there shouldn't be non-local food available. You can buy strawberries in the winter if you want to, unless there's so few people that it doesn't become economically viable to do anymore. But it's an option that people can live. But in this sort of idea of us being able to pursue our own vision of how we want to live our lives, and community being mostly just sort of a realm of rational discourse, it's private reasons, right? But that I'm expressing to you and hopefully convince you of in the future. So it very much fits into that kind of a model. So it's not just an economic model, but it's also a political liberal model of giving people freedom, in that liberal sense of freedom to pursue their vision of the good.
Well, that's very helpful. And I guess now we can dive into, there have been a bunch of critiques, I guess, of sort of this picture where there's all sorts of limitations. I mean, one is, I think something already mentioned, where it's sort of the passive consumer, making those choices using sort of their purchase power. And people are critiquing that idea of like the individual as sort of this autonomous, rational creature that can make those decisions, where choice is sort of a substantive notion, I guess, right? But if choice is, very limited for the start for many people, then, how much choice is there really, I guess, some people might worry. So what are some of the critiques that you think are sort of strongest, right? Something that we should immediately recognize? Sure.
So some of them are, like Laura DeLinde has written a paper about this, where she's critiquing local food in general, but it was prior to that paper. So maybe we changed her mind, because she's just thinking about this sub-movement as what local food is. And she says that, when we, if you think about the realm of all the things that you could do, all of your agency, all the ways that you could affect things that you think are wrong, live a good life, help one another, the broadest possible, you can think of yourself as a human being. And then you can get a little bit narrower and think of yourself as a citizen, right? So now a lot of the things that you might think of as ways you could act get delimited. As soon as I say the word citizen, you start to think about civics and, voting, that kind of thing. And then I can get even smaller and just think of you as a consumer. So the only option, the only way that you have to build this community that you say is valuable, to support the environment, to help local farmers, all these kinds of things that you like, is just through purchasing. So you've really restricted people's ability to do things. And, Laura points out that, that doesn't sort of encompass all of the ways that we are people and all the ways that we want to do stuff. So that's one kind of problem, just in a sort of general critique of thinking about ourselves as purchasers, is, you're making yourself very small, and your window is only choosing between options that are provided for you in a marketplace. So if options aren't there, there's nothing you can do. You can just buy one and hope that someday somebody starts to sell you the thing that you want. another thing is that, so, continuing on with that, local is something that companies quite like, right? If you're just a consumer, they'd love to provide it to you. As I was saying, Walmart is delighted to sell people local food for a few reasons. One, it makes people happy and then they shop there and that's wonderful. Two, they can distort, bully the local farmers because they can offer, we'll buy all of your carrots, but you have to sign a contract with us so you'll exclusively sell carrots to us. We only want you to grow this kind of carrot, and we're going to look at your carrots at the end, and we're only going to buy them if they are of a certain quality. And otherwise, you have to plow them back into the field or throw them away. That sounds kind of crazy that, I would just grow a huge field of carrots and then have to throw it all away. But actually, that happens quite frequently with these sorts of deals. So they can control the farmer, local farmers, because the local farmers are small, right? That's another nice thing about local food. Also, it seems one of those good words, local is, along with organic and fair trade, those sorts of things. But organic and fair trade are actually much harder to achieve. They are government enforced. Organic has a huge list of what it means to be organic. Fair trade has an independent certification agency. There's all kinds of stuff like that are a pain in the butt. But local is a descriptive term and doesn't have much meaning legally. What's local in the state of California? Is that local? Right? In North America, is that local? Right? So it's much vaguer, so they can put a label on that make people happy without doing anything. Also, of course, going back to something we were saying a little bit earlier, they're going to be able to achieve the letter of the law of something being local without getting at any of the stuff that people said they wanted in the first place with locality, right? Shopping at Walmart, for them to slowly drive these farmers out of business to buy local food. Well, that's not what I wanted with local. That's not why I wanted local food. So to the extent that you're just a consumer in the marketplace, you're at the whims of the way markets work, and markets work to consolidate power and to, undo a lot of the things that you say you like. So that's one kind of issue. If the reason why you want local food is because you want a more democratic and just society, it's unlikely that that's going to be one of the options on the shelves at the grocery store, a more democratic and just society, right? And you have to work for that in different ways, and that's sort of not on the table. The other thing, of course, is all the normal critiques that people make about local food are usually focused at unwittingly are focused just at this sub-movement. So people say, well, it's all very well and nice for you because you have the money to do this, right? But what about people who don't? And fair enough, right? If it's just one more thing that you purchase to show what a good person you are, like 90% recycled material or hemp reusable grocery bags or a Tesla or whatever it is, those often have price premiums because you're paying to show what a good person you are. And that's worth a certain amount of money to me. So it becomes a not fully inclusive movement. It's one focused on wealthy people demonstrating how good they are, which historically, doesn't get at a lot of the changes that people want, right? It's sort of a defanged political movement because, it's going to not include the poor people living in the community, the people living in inner cities who are struggling in, and I don't like this phrase, but the phrase that's usually used in the literature is a food desert, right? So with poor access to healthy food, it doesn't seem like this has much to offer them, except maybe in some sort of trickle down. I suppose they'll be helped down the road as long as we're doing good things up here at the, at the water source. Those kinds of critiques I think are right. So the idea here is that the effects will be muted because it can be easily and editorializing my part, but there's a risk of it being co-opted, of it not achieving the goals that the values that motivated the people that started it, of it being disinclusionary, of some of the most vulnerable people in a community, all those sorts of things, I think are, at least if you wanted to support this sort of individual food-focused movement, like lots of authors do, lots of chefs, lots of journalists, all kinds of people, they need to take all those critiques very seriously.
Yeah, I think we'll get back to that a bit later as well when we sort of understand all the different sub movements, right? Like the question of sort of how do we balance, I guess, these strategies, right? So maybe on the one hand you can have part of the individual strategy, but you must also recognize that you are part of a much bigger world than just yourself. But maybe just playing a devil's advocate and trying to find one angle where a justification might be offered. But you let me know if this makes sense or not at all. Which is sort of from one thing that we talked about with Professor Plekias was on the question of food labeling, right? Where the question on like actually understanding, right, from a sort of informational epistemological perspective, right? Like how much or what is really in there, right? Or what am I really eating? That, you know, in some sense, and these are my words, not her, like sort of there's an explosion of information, right? How are you going to work your way through that? Well, maybe you can't, maybe you become quite skeptical, maybe you want to retreat from sort of this explosion of information. So the strategy becomes, okay, I'm as an individual, I'm going to try to pursue some conception of local food that I think makes sense, where I am able to actually evaluate the information that lies ahead. And that's the only way where I can really justify my individual choices. Again, not acknowledging that there's all sorts of injustice, and you need to take those things into account when you think there's a duty or sort of obligation to start acting towards a different type of world. But anyway, like taking that strategy, right? Like, is there something there?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's right. So if you are working with this conception, so that people are individual choice makers in a market who are making choices like that, then, I think that's right. I think that people, let's assume lots of people, some number of people want to do good, and the way that they can do good under this model is through their purchasing decisions. And so they want to purchase good in both the ungrammatical sense, so they want to purchase well, and also they want to purchase good. They'd like to buy goodness if they could, right?
Yeah.
And so they want to, but it's really hard. And one of the ways in which it is hard is epistemic burdens. In fact, I've written quite a lot about social epistemology and food, which we can get to later. But here we're just thinking about individual epistemology, right? The burdens of knowing and learning about all of this stuff is intense. So people aren't going to do it, because rationally it's not worth it. They need to think about other things in their lives. And even if you convince them that they ought to, they would need to do the same thing in every other aspect of their life. So what about the sourcing of the clothes that they're wearing? What about, all sorts of stuff. So what you want to do is give people an easy handle that will allow them to get a lot of the good at any rate, with fairly simple labeling. That's true, right? If you're working with this conception of what food is, a commodity to be purchased, what people are, people who purchase things and signal their preferences through their purchase decisions, that this sort of, and that information is what they use in order to make that, but that information is complex and overwhelming. I think that all of that follows, right? Which is a powerful thing in the individual focused sort of sub-movement within local food, because, to an extent, all of that is true. It's, I'm not going to say that one way of looking at people is true or false, but that way of looking at people, we are sometimes that. Increasingly, we're trying to build a society where we are exclusively that. And, that would be one problem that you might want to say with our current society, is that it tries to make us only that, but we are sometimes that. And, so in this arena, in this perspective on what it is to be alive, then I think that a lot of that is right.
Yeah. And then maybe, continuing this discussion, I guess, like you already mentioned, right? Like there's also this framework where we are citizens, right? Which, makes us part of a larger society, different institutions that are part of that society. So let's move to sort of this second sub-movement that you discussed, which is the systems focused sub-movement. So maybe just start framing, right? Like what's the main difference between the individual focused sub-movement, if you sort of simplify it and dumb it down? Like,
sure.
What's the difference?
Yeah, well, one way to sort of get at it would be to think about, if I convince you of a lot of problems of the global food system, and I say local food helps a bunch, and I've convinced you about that, and you say, okay, great, well, what should I do? Right. And by the way, every sort of like documentary or anything about problems, will lay out problems very convincingly, maybe even like lay out a vision of what a better society might look like fairly convincingly. And then there's a little something over the credits where it says, what should I do? One of my favorite examples of that is Al Gore's An Inconvenient Truth, where it's like climate change is going to pose serious threats to the continuation of civilization. You're like, oh, geez, that sounds bad. And then over the credits, it says, take shorter showers, buy LED light bulbs, which it would be that individual focused movement, right?
Yeah.
This is a big problem. All I can do is purchase different stuff. For the systems focused, the answer of what we should do, rather than what I should do, is we should have different policies in place. We should have different social institutions, and that those different social institutions will lead to different outcomes, right? So, imagine if the Inconvenient Truth had said, well, there ought to be stronger caps on carbon emissions, right? In one sense, and again, this is why I want to say these are different ways of looking at. I have biases, but all of them have some value. It's like, okay, well, I can't. How do I lower? What are you talking about? How do I lower carbon production, right? Likewise, when you start talking about social forces, well, what do I do?
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, and the truth is that you by yourself, all alone with no support from anyone else, can't really do anything. If you're looking at things as systems, right? Because we're looking at people as participants in social institutions. And so one participant in a social institution is unlikely to be able to significantly affect the social institution. You can only do it democratically through organization and through a large number of people working together, and then they can alter that social institution. And in the case of food, you're looking at food as a good that is distributed through social institutions.
Yeah.
Rather than looking at it as a thing that is purchased as a commodity, you're looking at it as a social good. So it wouldn't have to necessarily be purchased. It might be given away, right? It depends on what sort of policies we have put in socially. So people are now participants in democracies, ideally, or at any rate in social institutions of various kinds, and food is a necessity of life, a very important good that is distributed through these social institutions. And so under this model, local food is one way of distributing that good. And it has various advantages, right? Probably, you wouldn't want to say exclusively local food. By the way, we haven't even really talked about that, but I think even the strongest advocates of local food mean maximally local food, right? People living in very cold places with 9 months of snow, you do need healthy vegetables, but people mean maximally local, right? Or more local than we have now. So that's a better way of distributing food because of all of the benefits that we've been talking about to the environment, to local economies, to our ability to participate in social institutions, right? If people are meeting each other at the farmer's market and sharing recipes and, getting to know everyone around them, then non-food related issues that might come up to the community can be more easily addressed because we're practicing participation. We're practicing being together in the agora and, working together to shape the world that we want to live in rather than individually purchasing and signaling the world that I wish existed. So, so there's lots of these kinds of benefits and all the other ones you said, food miles reduces fossil fuel burning. It helps with, local food can be more responsive to local needs and local wishes, right? Maybe our communities want to have something like that, right? That can all fit in there too. But this is just like thinking about a good way of distribution, right? A maximally democratic, maximally local has advantages. And so we ought to build a society that has mechanisms that promote that. And so then we're talking about things like laws, like regulations, like maybe even alternative ways of distribution. So, you might say, well, people don't have access to good, healthy local food in inner cities. There should be something done about that. We should make sure that the government distributes that so that people have access to enough food to live in their basket of allowances that our society gives us. Because if we have enough money to do it as a society, it's a necessity for life. So we should make sure people have it. And, you can do it in different ways. People who are people who have jobs can buy it with cash. Sure. They're getting factor payments, but people that don't have jobs, like children, for example, I don't think about that a lot, but you don't necessarily want to place the burden of all economic or of all goods distribution on the parents of children, or elderly people or disabled people or unemployed people, right? These sorts of like big groups of people need other kinds of factor payments. They need other kinds of good distribution. So we need to make sure they get food. You can do free schools, free lunch programs, free breakfast programs, even free breakfast, lunch, dinner programs in schools for children. You can have, right now we have private charities in the United States like Meals on Wheels, but you could imagine social institutions that distribute food to the elderly and disabled. Unemployed people should get some kind of way of getting food. Weirdly in America, uniquely in America, I'm pretty sure, I don't know of any other country that does this. We give people food stamps, so you can buy only food, EBT payments, which is one way to do it, I suppose. It's weird. I think, it'd probably just make more sense to give them money and assume that they're going to spend some of their money on food because they need to live. So there's a weird assumption that if we don't give people food only money, that they're going to spend it on t-shirts and then not eat, which seems, I've never met anybody that does that. It could quickly be eliminated in society. Yeah. But we like to in America, we resent poor people in a profound way, and we like to punish them and make their lives as onerous and demeaning as possible. And one way of doing that is saying, all right, I'll give you food, but I bet you would buy alcohol and drugs if I gave you money. So I'm just going to give you money for food. And also then we can have a big debate as a society about what sort of food we let them purchase with their EBT payments, right? So they can only get, food that we would like to, that as Americans we would like to support, like American grown produce, and things that we think are healthy, because poor people are unhealthy and isn't that bad. So we can control them in a big way by saying what EBT can and can't be purchased on. Like, you can't use it to purchase hot food in the United States, because we don't want, we think they should cook. We think poor people, if you're unemployed, you should, or you're disabled, or you're elderly, you should cook. Seems like a weird choice, but okay, right? Mm-hmm. So, I have critiques about this. I've written about this, mm-hmm. but the idea is, we need to make sure that people have this food, right? We need to set up social institutions that give this to them. And wouldn't it be nice if it were local? I mean, there's a really good sort of example of this. I was just insulting EBT, although obviously it's very important for lots of people. WIC benefits also, which is women and infants and children. It's money for them, for pregnant women and for mothers with young children to get some, again, basic staples. But a lot of states, I think this was initially, oh man, I don't remember exactly which state this started in. I think it started in the Appalachian Mountain region of the United States, but I'm blanking on whether it was Kentucky or somewhere else. But now lots of states, the farmers markets will have double up food bucks. So if you're going to spend government issued EBT money, so government money to buy food only, at a farmer's market, the state will double your purchasing power. So $1 becomes $2. Yeah. And the idea here is that A, you're supporting local farmers, so that's good. We want to do that. B, you're letting people buy healthy, fresh vegetables and fruit and all that sort of good stuff, which is good. So it's better for the women and the pregnant women and the children. It's better for unemployed people, whatever reasoning you have for getting government food assistance. And, it's getting you out, it's getting you to connect with the community. Some people, this argument isn't made as explicitly by politicians, but by some people who support double up food bucks, say that, there's a real isolation in spending EBT and other sorts of, food stamps like that, because, it's a little embarrassing. And we've tried to minimize that in the US by making it look like a credit card. But there's still some stigma. But if I have a lot of strong purchasing power, and these farmers are trying to sell their groceries to support their farm, the stigma is much reduced. They're delighted to see these people. They're delighted to get to have money and support their farm. So actually have a much better interaction. Yeah. So there's all these advantages, and it was done at the systematic policy level, right? It wasn't through nobody shopping at the farmer's market created double up food bucks. It was through activism, through convincing representatives in the quasi sort of pretend, not really representative democracy we live in. It was through mechanisms of democratic social engineering, and what they're trying to do is socially engineer the participants in these institutions to purchase more local food, right? Rather than thinking about one individual person's preferences, right? They just assume, we can distribute food this way. If it's twice as much, if food's more expensive at a farmer's market, people won't buy food there. But with doubling up food bucks, then people will, because hopefully it's not twice as expensive at a farmer's market. And so now it's rationally, makes sense for people to do that. And so at the population level, more people will do that.
Mm-hmm. This is very helpful. So, and maybe just to summarize a few points that sort of stand out to me. So we started sort of with this individual sub movement, right? Where, we sort of came to the conclusion, right? Like, we live in a society, there's all sorts of political structures in place. We must realize that and recognize that. And that changes the questions on how to think about food. But then it also sort of becomes clear to me that on the one hand, even when we recognize, sure, like these institutions play an important role, right? And we have these political structures for a reason, and they can bring about change. That only sort of really is the starting point, I guess, of the policy question, right? Because then still you can treat the citizens, right, like they're passive sort of people that have to be helped, right? Like that sort of a picture where the government is stepping in and sort of this paternalistic sort of a picture versus more an active participant, right? Like how can we sort of create a structure where people can participate, right, and can make those decisions and think about it in that way, right? So on the one hand, I feel like there's sort of this recognition, sure, yes, these political structures. On the other hand, one way of sort of like thinking about this structure would be, oh yeah, sure, there needs to be a structure that then let sort of the market be as it is, right? So then sure, we still have the institutions, but they will say, but leave the rest alone, right? So in that sense, might that be a worry, right? Like, sure, it is that, but then we're still left with all the questions that we have to answer.
So to answer your question, right. So the system focused, this is just a system focused, right? It's focusing on participants in a system, on various social institutions, and saying, well, we ought to make these social institutions good, right? Right. But then what does good mean and how does it work is one sort of question. But hopefully that would be decided at a political democratic kind of level, right? So it's pushing you, much in the way that individual focus is pushing you to convincing individual people culturally to make these new kinds of decisions. And then assuming that if individual people make this kind of decision of saying, I'm going to buy this, I'll pay a premium for this, then the machine that we don't really ask any questions about will sort of shift and give it to us. Right, because it'll respond, it's sensitive to price signals. In this one, we have to work together to create social institutions that do a good job, that effectively distribute this commodity, or, well, I mean, you can use the word commodity if you want, but to distribute this good around to people. You want to make sure that people are getting enough food. You want to make sure that, they're getting healthy food, I suppose, right? It's not just a calorie count, but enough micronutrients, so that's kind of good deal. To the extent, a harder thing for the system focus to deal with, but not impossible, is those kinds of issues of dignity. You don't want to embarrass people. It's not super sensitive to that, except to the extent that sometimes it interferes with these distributions of goods. So people don't want to use food stamps because it's embarrassing. Mm-hmm. Okay, well, we're not going to try to convince people that it's not embarrassing. We're not going to try to that doesn't work. Let's just make it look like a credit card, because then it just looks like a debit card. People run the debit card, and use goes up. Right? So you're looking at sort of broad levels. You're not thinking about individual people feeling embarrassed. You're just thinking about usage, right? So there's better participation. Also, if it's clearer and easier to apply for, which is always famously a problem in the United States, we always want to make everything some weird, insane math test that you have to take, but so that being poor is now like you have a second job of being poor while you're also trying to find new work if you're unemployed, for example. So unemployment applications are incredibly onerous in the US because we want people to not participate. Mm-hmm. Which is its own sort of issue. But so society participants in these social institutions should debate that. Do we want people to be able to participate? Do we want it to be onerous, so only people who are educated or good at filling out forms or enjoy filling out forms and waiting in line on the phone can do this? Or do we want it to maximally distribute it in like sort of an equitable way? Are we trying to pursue some sort of equality of outcome so that it turns out that everybody has good, healthy food, or good, healthy food until a certain age or something? So we can have these public debates, and then we can work to reform the system, but it requires political activism. Now, usually, so that's the level of operation. Usually in this, I was talking a lot about factor payments for people that are unemployed. So that means temporarily lost their job, children, elderly, disabled, right? Lots of different kinds of people. And people with jobs buy food, as I said. So one of the social institutions that's sort of like floating around is the market still again, right? So it's still right there. But that's just seen as like one other mechanism for distribution, which, in some countries would be, or in some communities, even some neighborhoods, would be the far and away majority of the way that food is distributed. In other places and at other times might be in the minority. Maybe, due to famine or due to poverty in an area, maybe very few people would spend actual cash from their job on food. But these are all just sort of neutral in this model ways of distributing this neutral good, right? Of just food. Everybody wants food. We're going to make sure it goes to places, and then people have it, right? So it's again at this kind of remove, which has some advantages, but also there's some criticisms.
Mm-hmm. So maybe we can dive a bit into the criticism, and then maybe start talking about sort of the community-focused sub-movement. So I guess if I remember correctly, one of sort of the criticisms was, right, that by sort of taking this systems-focused sort of approach, right, sometimes you're also taking on those values of these institutions that you might not want to really accept. So you're sort of already dealing with the wrong system of values in order to navigate and sort of try to approach these type of questions. Could you maybe sort of elaborate on that worry, I suppose?
Yeah, there are some criticisms of the systems focused model, right? One set of them that I'll just sort of point at but not really go into is if you enjoy the individual focused model, and maybe we can talk about this at the end when we think about compatibility, then you'd say, well, but the systems focused misses out on some stuff that we can capture, like literally what can I do today, right? Or the importance of changing people's cultural sort of idea around food or their preferences, right? Convincing, right? All that kind of stuff. Not in like just in the public democratic, war for power kind of sense, but in the like showing people that food is tasty kind of sense. Mm-hmm. So you can make those critiques, but what I'm more interested in are the critiques of sustainable or of the system focused model that say, by looking at food as a good that is distributed, you're missing out on the way that the role that food plays to a lot of people. So one kind of example that I get into in, I think the book chapter version of this, or that I should say that Dr. Noel and I get into, is salmon fishing in the Pacific Northwest in the United States for indigenous people. There's a real problem when the fish have too high of levels of PCBs, of lead, of mercury, things like that, that make the fish toxic. So they shouldn't eat them. Well, this is a real problem. What are we going to do? Well, the solution is we'll send them canned tuna, right? Great. So we've lost one food source. That was a good that was distributed. It was locally distributed in a really nice way because it sort of self-regenerated. The salmon just show up. People can get it themselves. You don't have to worry about payment. So everybody can do it. I mean, not everybody can fish, but luckily the community is set up in certain ways where people who can fish for people who can't fish. So great. What a great distribution system. Unfortunately, it doesn't work now because factories are polluting those rivers ways, and the fish are bad for you, particularly if you are pregnant or nursing, but really anybody. So we'll distribute the goods in another way, and we feel bad. Maybe even that doesn't really fit in the model, but you could say we feel bad that this has happened to them, so we won't even charge them, right? We'll just give this food. And what happens in that particular case, and in many similar sorts of cases, is that people don't want the canned food. They don't like it. They don't eat it. They continue to fish and get sick. Well, why would you do that? That doesn't make any sense. Mm. And the reason why is because the food isn't merely a good that is distributed, that is interchangeable with all other kinds of food, right? At least to some people. And, I'll just sketch this a little bit because we'll talk about it more in a minute. We talk about a different model of food. Food has other meanings that aren't captured in this kind of model. And when that happens, you find that people don't respond the way that you would predict, right? So you're missing out, you're doing some injustices, you're doing some harms to these communities, arguably, if you can get them to switch over. Another example is a practice that's widely critiqued, known as food dumping. I said earlier, governments say, hey, well, we can buy wheat at an inflated price from farmers in the United States to keep them in business, and then we'll just give it away to poor countries. And so these countries don't have food. They're suffering from famine. If you've read your Amartya Sen, then you'll be suspicious of that sentence, that the problem of a famine is that they literally don't have food. That's almost never the problem in famine. Usually it's a distributional problem. There's lots of food in the country, but they can't get it to people because the economy has shut down. But anyway, let's assume that actually there's no food. Farmers are barely scraping by, subsistence corn farmers. So what we're going to do is we're just going to give away a ton of wheat. And you find that and should be great, right? A new way of distributing goods. But And yet that practice, like I said, it's called food dumping. And it's widely criticized by anti-colonial activists because they say this harms our communities in lots of really important ways. And the system focused version of local food doesn't really see what that is. They say, well, okay, I mean, like local food is good, but local food isn't working right now. So we're just, we're distributing it in this new way. And sure, local food has various efficiencies and has various like cool benefits, but those aren't achievable right now. So, so local food isn't as important in the systems model as just good distribution. That's just seen as sort of a means to an end. And if there are reasons that people value certain aspects of local food, which we've been sort of talking around in this whole conversation, then, that's not going to be reflected. It's not going to be embedded in this focus.
But and so one response, I guess, but I'm not sure if that brings us out of sort of this sort of a system focus, would be just to say, no, that's just insensitivities, right, within the system, right? Like if those should be taken care of, because the system as a whole embodies much more than just distributing goods. It also embodies actually a value system that we think sort of speaks through those institutions. Like that's the real issue. I guess maybe we can set it aside and move to the sort of community focused sub movement, but then try to get back to this question in the sense that, okay, there is this other sub movement that is, I guess, having that sort of claim against the system's sort of focused view that they can't, I suppose, or they just don't. I'm not sure like what the best way would be to term that, tackle that issue. But so maybe like move to the sort of community sort of focus sub movement, but then we can revisit that question, I suppose.
Sure. Yeah. And yeah, we'll see when we think about compatibility that, at a certain level, it's just sort of, where do you like to draw lines, right? How separated do you like to keep your peas and your carrots and your potatoes on the plate? If you want to say, well, this doesn't fit in there, so if you are doing it, then it's because you've combined two things. Or you say, well, this could expand to, that becomes sort of a semantic argument. So it's just only interesting for people who like to do analysis. But it's just worth pointing out that there's this third sort of way of thinking about things, a third kind of focus, right? I mean, notice that in all of these, we're saying focus. Yes. We're not saying exclusive domain or something like that, right? That you're focusing on individuals, or you're focusing on systems, or you're focusing, in this case, on communities. And so in this focus, when we think of people, we're thinking of people and food and community as being sort of co-constituted with one another, so that an important part of people's identity is the food that they eat, right? That food plays a very important role in who they are, and it's very meaningful to them. And that's true in lots of ways, right? That might be, of course, that's true for farmers, not just the fact that that's how they get money to purchase goods, and also, they directly eat some of the food from their own farm, but being a farmer is important to their sense of identity and to being, into their sort of their value and their self-worth. Likewise, think about all the ways that food informs who you are. Maybe you keep a particular diet, you're vegan or vegetarian, or you keep halal or you keep kosher because that's meaningful to you, or just that you have particular recipes that your family always eats, or just that you think that licorice is gross and terrible and bad, but your entire family, loves to come together and have, Thanksgiving dinners, or you have learned how to make pasta and you love to do that, to make fresh pasta and show people and talk about how actually it's quite easy and you should all try it, right? So that who we are is built in our relationships with one another. We aren't individual actors kind of moving around, these isolated nomads purchasing things, nor are we, again, this is about focus. So I would say we're not only that. We also aren't only sort of, something in an Excel spreadsheet, some sort of like participant moving through a system, and we want to make sure the system they're moving through is well designed and distributes things to them well. We're also, a third thing, people, right? We are beings that have personalities and identities and histories and pasts. We have heirloom varieties of tomatoes and heirloom recipes for preparing those tomatoes that have some kind of meaning to us. And those are only co-constituted with other people. Right? So they aren't constituted, we aren't just born as an individual market person. We aren't just sort of formed by social forces around us, large scale social institutional forces, like, public elementary school, but also through interactions with other people, intersubjectivity, through building community. We are the kind of people who do this. We are the kind of people who don't do this. And that those kinds of senses become internalized, important to who you are. And it just turns out that for humans, a big part of that is about food. Taboos around what we do and don't eat, taboos about the way we eat it, particular practices and norms about what about how you have to do something, or about what real something is, like, oh, a real name national dish has to have whatever thing in it, right? I mean, a great example of that, if anybody's interested, is go look at, in Wikipedia, you can look at edits and comments that have been made by editors. Go look at the Wikipedia entry on paella and look at one of the biggest fights I've ever seen on the internet of people arguing what real paella is, like whether it has to have this particular kind of rice or it doesn't have to have this kind of rice. And people are fighting because it's offensive to their sense of who they are. Like, look, in the town in Spain that I grew up in, what you're talking about would not have been counted as paella, and my grandmother wouldn't have let you eat with us, right? These are very important. So to the extent that there's that kind of identity building, intersubjective identity building, and community building through food, well, you can see why that focus is going to feel like it's not really getting much out of the individual focus or the systems focus. But you can also see why I'd be really interested in local food, local food production, teaching one another about these things, recovering ways of feeding each other. So again, as I said before, I don't really love the phrase food deserts. For a number of reasons. Just as an aside, it's as some activists in Detroit told me, deserts are beautiful, rich ecological systems, and they're nobody's fault. And none of that is true about food deserts, right? So food areas where where neighborhoods have no access to local healthy food, that harms this community. And that community is usually suffering from lots of other things too. If all the grocery stores have moved out of a city, also probably most of the other industries have moved out of that city, so there's rampant poverty. Because of that, there's very little infrastructure support, so that, they don't have access to fire departments quickly, or, as we know in Detroit and Flint, I did a lot of work on environmental justice and food justice in Michigan for my PhD, to healthy water. Police are seen as sort of an outside force that's policing them rather than, all those sorts of things. Lots of problems in that community. And by having this, and we're getting back to this sort of idea of a regenerative food system, of having a local food system that can give people local healthy food, yes, get people to know each other, also build intergenerational connections so that young people can help old people by gardening for them, old people can teach young people how to cook, by getting a sense of pride again, by making this neighborhood where you live in beautiful with all of these outdoor gardens instead of, abandoned lots as buildings are torn down or burned down. That is part of building up this community, which is necessary, this focus would argue, because that's part of building who we are. We only become a person intersubjectively, and so we need some sort of community relationships to do that. And local food is a great way to sort of support those and to strengthen them. So in that case, the question isn't what can I purchase differently in order to bring about local food and all of its great benefits or whatever. And we haven't even talked about some of the just straight critiques of local food. Maybe we can do that later, but or what we, speaking broadly as participants in a social system, we citizens, so we purchasers or we citizens can do to engineer social institutions such that we all have access to healthy food, and local food is a very good way to do that and has other great benefits. And isn't that nice too? But rather, they're saying that we as a community, what can we do right now to strengthen our bonds with one another, to help one another, to better understand ourselves and each other? So the move is not purchase things or vote and do political activism per se, but rather let's start a community garden. Let's start local food systems, alternative food systems. Let's have let's at that community garden, let's teach people how to garden for the first time if they don't know how, and let's have free classes on how to cook, and let's visit people in our community that need help and are socially isolated, be they elderly or disabled people, and bring them some of that food if they can't come and participate. And let's, so it's building alternative systems outside of it. That's thinking about it existing already in like the United States and other sorts of like first world contexts, although poor cities within those, so marginalized spaces within first world countries. But in third world countries, this translates very much like the food sovereignty movement. So we don't have access, we as a community don't have access to land. We're not allowed to grow food, even though that's very much part of who we were. We're getting pushed off the land, there's a lot of incentives and just straight terrible actions to push people into working in bad conditions in cities. But we can provide our own food. We can re-strengthen this community as then like a nexus for addressing other social injustices. So this kind of focus, this community focus, sees building community as a part of participatory justice, addressing racism issues, like I was mentioning in Detroit, addressing mercury poisoning in the ground, addressing lead poisoning in the water, addressing policing, addressing housing and gentrification issues, that all of this is kind of connected. And food is a great way to do that because everybody eats, everyone sits down at a table together to talk about it.
And maybe building all of that. So we've been talking from sort of the individual sort of perspective, right? Like how that's tied up with maybe broader liberal sort of political philosophy. You also highlight, right, that like sort of the sub movement that we just discussed, right, which is more focused on the community, is highly critical, or at least critical, sort of against this liberal political theory. So then actually you mentioned that maybe a more natural fit would be sort of, and then you mentioned sort of different political sort of positions, I guess. So you talk about anti-colonialism, that's, I think, what you just mentioned, but also communal anarchism. So could you maybe just elaborate a little bit more on imagining that type of system, right? Like,
if you want to think about it in that framework, which I'm delighted to, you can think about the individual focus as being sort of a market realist, neoliberal kind of model, and then trying to do good in that model. The social system as being sort of a collective socialist kind of project and trying to do good in that model. And then the community focus one as being, you could say communitarian, but that has a lot of baggage in philosophy, but anarchist, maximally democratic, rhizomatic, horizontal organizational kind of system, and then trying to do good in that model. And all of them are thinking about local food as sort of a good way to do the kind of things, the kind of good that they're trying to do.
And maybe now we can then also discuss how we maybe put some of these pieces together, I guess, because everyone that has been listening, I guess, now understands, right, the different angles that, or the different focuses, I guess, that we can have. Although then I guess the big question remains, right, how are we sort of balancing these different perspectives?
Sure.
And maybe you could tell me about sort of, where do you see the balance?
Yeah. And first, let me say, by the way, just to be fair, there are critiques of the community focused system too.
Yeah, of course.
I would feel mean if I didn't. If I said one and beat up on it, said second and beat up, and said a third and didn't beat up on it a little bit.
Makes sense.
And it actually leads us back into this idea of complementarity. The critique of the community focused one would say, woof, man, that's a lot, right? So hold on. So local food is going to give me anti-racist policies and anti-patriarchy and anarchist political organization and non-hierarchical ways of humans interacting. What the heck? All of this on food? Man, I just want to eat corn. What are you doing? It's a lot for local food to carry is sort of a critique that a lot of people have made of this sort of focus of food sovereignty generally. Like, why is this on food? The response would be something along the lines of, well, you could say maybe it's just convenient because, as I was saying, everybody eats. So because we're all eating, it's just a good place for us to think about how we interact with one another. Or maybe there's something about food, right? Maybe like I was saying, if you, in the community focused system, if you're thinking about food as something that is part and parcel of our construction of our identity, it does seem to have a role that is different than shirts that we wear or shoes that we wear or cars that we drive. Even though those are also stuff that we interact with every day, they don't have the same sort of like deep meaning for us. Maybe. But anyway, so yeah, you want to think about how can these go together? And I mean, this is the classic question, right? It's the same issue with climate change or with nuclear disarmament, or pick any really wicked, depressing problem. And wicked problem is it's a term of art in academia. So I literally mean a wicked problem, something where people can't even agree what the problem is, or if there's a problem, the most powerful people have an interest in maintaining the status quo, so they don't think there is a problem at all. People have no way of knowing if you're making progress on it. People fundamentally disagree with each other on what progress would even look like, all these sorts of things, right? And so you have to think, so whenever there are these wicked problems, should we and can we, and to what extent ought we to work together if people say that they want the same thing, but they're coming from really different backgrounds, and you could easily pull them apart, or maybe we should work together in these sorts of coalitions. How do we do all that, right? Like that's this is the question facing anyone like that, there's going to be problems, of course, but I sort of like the way Brian Norton talks about this in his book on sustainability, which is that, although he's coming from a very sort of liberal political framework, but he says that if we can all agree on people from different sorts of perspectives on metrics that we can work toward that would push forward a better world, then great. If not, then we have to go to a whole different kind of argument. But if we can, then there's no reason why people can't work together, right? So local food is a really good example of that. If the individual focus says, hey, it's nice to buy local food, it makes me feel good about myself, it's all these sorts of things, I want to purchase them, that isn't incompatible with, we should also design systems and regulations that penalize extractive market relationships and encourage people to buy local food, like I was saying, double up food bucks, and communities building alternative food systems. Right? In fact, the people from the first group might want to shop at the thing from the third group, and they could use the double up bucks from the second group, right? So you can find projects that everyone can endorse. And I think double up food bucks is actually a great example. And when you have those sorts of projects, then great, go full force. Right. But the danger in these kinds of social movements is people that have the more radical kind of background are too easily used, is maybe a strong word, but brought into a coalition to work on something, and then have the aim of that coalition slowly shift towards the ones that have all of the money and support, right? Because remember, as I said, the individual food system has financial support. Right, because it's working within a market context, because it's a thing that Walmart can make a profit off of, they're going to have a lot more of a say. And so if you want that to not happen, then you have to structure the way that you work together to either be very conditional and project by project based. That's the way some activist groups do things, or make sure that in that organization, if there's like sort of a sitting thing, a good example of this is our food policy councils, which I'll talk about in a second. Then you have to make sure that those explicitly have mechanisms in place for letting marginalized people who might not naturally be able to participate, have more of a participatory role. So food policy councils are a thing that have been tried in some cities and states in the United States to have stakeholders from lots of different aspects of a city, say, come together and talk about what sorts of food policies would be good. I think this is the right kind of model. Some food policy councils have done a really good job of letting people who have radical kinds of commitments have a strong voice, people who are from poor communities, who don't have any other option, right? So, it's like, I'd like to buy local food, but I can afford to have, fish flown in from Alaska too, that those people don't need to have as strong of a voice in the council, right? Because they're not as impacted by what happens, right? So you can set things up in a participatorily just way to increase equity outcomes, right? That's nice. Or you can have one that's sort of neutral, in which case activist groups might, participate sometimes, but not other times. Some projects they work on jointly, other ones they don't want to work on, so you have this sort of like shifting alliance. So there's different models of ways you can do that. The danger with food policy councils, of course, and this is also a problem with systems-focused sort of approaches, is because it is sort of quasi endorsed by the city, they can be removed. So Detroit had a food policy council that was then sort of erased when political forces changed and more conservative voices came to power in the city.
I see. And then that sort of idea, I guess, does seem to fit again with, like, I mean, again, like the sort of community focused approach, right? But I guess the question really becomes, I mean, that maybe also relates to the issue you just mentioned, is when certain sort of community approaches, right, sort of rise up to a certain level where, okay, now they start interacting with sort of the institutional level, right, where big institutions, that's where sort of the collapse, or I guess the friction happens, right? Where like, how do these institutions absorb, I guess, more of these community voices that are on the ground, where sort of there's the lived experience, I guess, right? Which is ultimately what we're trying to take into account, I suppose.
Right. I mean, ultimately, this is the struggle. So, food sovereignty movements ought to, you would think, be aligned with large multinational, international food security stuff through the IMF, the World Bank, groups like that. They want food security, they say. Great. Well, food sovereignty activists, their critique is food security isn't secure, because the food security that they're pursuing is by saying we're going to integrate everyone into a global food network, so that way we can be very responsive. If there's storms over here and a drought over here, we can move food around and everybody will get food and it'll be great. And food sovereignty activists say that actually that's very insecure. Like I was saying before, food dumping pushes farmers off the land because they can't compete with free, free handed away wheat. And so they are then when that recedes and the benefit goes away, the farmers are now not farming anymore. Now they're working, and this is explicitly pursued in Haiti, for example. Like, this was an on-purpose thing that they did. So you can look at stuff even like with the Clinton Foundation, various other groups. But anyway, that you get people to be making T-shirts, and so now they're making T-shirts and they can purchase food. And in some food security models, that's good. We should only have big farms run by mostly machine in large flat areas like the Midwest of the United States producing staple crops. And you should work making, growing flowers in Colombia, or working at a T-shirt factory in Haiti, and use the money that you have to purchase some of the wheat that we grow. So food sovereignty activists say that that's not a good model. It's actually insecure, because what if you stop buying T-shirts, right? There's lots of errors in that. People who are participating as kind of junior partners, because they're marginalized, they can't do as much. So our system's more secure. If you can find ways to work together on a project, if let's imagine that the IMF and World Bank and these other sorts of large international organizations were genuinely trying to do this, then they would say, oh, well, that's a good project. Okay, I like this thing you're doing. We'll support that. And if they don't, then you say, well, then actually you're not really working. You're not really trying to make things better. And so, this is the question of activism, right? Can you work with institutions? Well, if the institutions are genuinely trying to make things good, then you should be able to find places where you coincide. And to the extent that you don't, well, then you have to wonder if they're actually working on the things they say they are.
Oh, yeah, that's a fair point. So, and then you also have written a bit about the value of self-determination. So maybe we can shift there a little bit. What is this importance of this value, and how does it sort of play a role when evaluating food policies?
Sure. So, I mean, self-determination in general is just the ability to pursue your projects and plans. When you think about it at the community level, right, community self-determination, that's the ability of communities to jointly come together and make plans and pursue their ends. And that's, I mean, you could do this from like very much a sort of normal capabilities kind of approach way, that people have to be able to come together. They have to be able to discuss things with one another. They have to be able to act jointly. They have to have, various sorts of things in order to do that. If you want to play a game of soccer, you can't do that unless there's a number of other people that want to play a game of soccer with you. You can only collectively have that aim and pursue it, right? So this is kind of the idea of self-determination generally. But what I like to look at and think about are some of the epistemic, the knowledge production and knowledge evaluation sort of roots of self-determination, that there's epistemic self-determination. So in order to make plans and to act, You have to be able to know some things. You have to be able to have your values built into it. And it turns out that that actually is very connected to food in lots of ways. So, but just to give you an example first about, sort of epistemic self-determination, in environmental justice, in the United States, the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, will do an impact, or they require impact statements of various things you're trying to do. And so they'll say, okay, well, so how polluted is this river? How polluted is this area? And they have to model this based on a person. And the person that they imagine might be, and this is a only barely hypothetical example, somebody who lives in the area but works outside of the area, is an adult man, and purchases food with the money they get working outside of the area from grocery stores. What's their environmental, what's the toxic load in the environment on them? But the community that, then we can decide something safe. The community might say that, well, now hold on a second. We actually, in our community, really want to know what's the environmental burden on children who live there and swim in the water and, hang out all the time, or on the elderly, or on people who eat a lot of that fish, getting back to that issue, because it's meaningful to them and it's important to them to eat this fish. We value the load on the most vulnerable people. So we want to think about what's the load on the people who are most exposed. Or they might say, what you deem as a safe level, we actually think we'd rather play it more safe than sorry than that. So we'd rather lower our level. We'd rather have some false positives rather than false negatives. And all of those kinds of questions, there isn't a right answer actually, or a wrong answer on what you ought to do. I could make some arguments, but these are just sort of value judgments that are built into the epistemic system that you're using to judge what's going on and you're using to plan, right? You need to be able to embed your values in the judgments you're making of the data that's coming in. Otherwise, it's just numbers, right? In order to understand it, if something is safe or dangerous, right? There's no objective answer to that question without reflecting values of what you consider to be safe and dangerous and for whom and over what time period and things like that. So, does it have to be a proven danger, or is there a potential? Does a potential of a danger count until you've proven that it's safe? That precautionary principle. You have to prove that it's safe or prove that it's dangerous, that sort of thing. So all of those kinds of value judgments are built into epistemic systems for any complex question. And if a community doesn't have the ability to do that, then they can't participate. They can't act. They don't have the self-determination to act, to have a voice in the decision of whether or not to locate this potential pollution source. Right. So Kristen Schrader-Fachette, in her book on environmental justice, talks about what meaningful participation from communities looks like in these kinds of decisions. So what I've argued is that, she's basically right. But when looking at food in particular, certain food policies increase people's ability to have epistemic self-determination at a community level, and other kinds of policies reduce it and make it harder for them to do that. And so if that's true, we should try to value things that increase it, because, like in the United States, the FDA, the Food and Drug Administration, has a lot of weird, when it makes policy decisions, it has a lot of weird things that it's trying to maximize, has a lot of weird values built into it, right? So like one good example is in the United States, the US government, or the USDA in this case, but doesn't matter, a different organization, the US government, might simultaneously have as one of its missions to maximize dairy consumption in the United States, because we're trying to support dairy farmers. And this is not a hypothetical example, by the way. This is true. But also, they want to maximize. They try to make people healthier, try to have people eat more healthily. That's one of their missions. And so, in the same year that they try to tell people to consume less fat from dairy sources, they also give money to companies like Domino's Pizza to get them to research ways to use more cheese in their pizza, leading to the stuffed crust pizza explosion, because that uses more dairy, and so dairy farmers have a new market. Next time you eat a stuffed crust pizza, you can thank the research and development funds from the United States government that helped bring you this pizza. You're welcome, world. But they're doing that at the same time as they're telling people to eat less of that sort of thing. So
So
we have these weird missions. And so all I'm kind of arguing is that, sorry, but another thing that we ought to be thinking about is whether or not these policies are increasing community epistemic self-determination.
I see. And I mean, this might be like a obvious point that's maybe not worth mentioning, but part of what you just mentioned is sort of seeing the contradictions in sort of these missions of these different actors, where, I mean, either because it's maybe too vaguely defined, where ultimately like the sort of on the ground policies, how they're sort of worked out and come to fruition, create sort of contradictory results, or at least strange results, where you think, okay, a better strategy could have been in place to, you know, actually reach certain missions or make them more concrete. That's an interesting point. And part of, like, so if I'm trying to understand it correctly, is like to see sort of these assumptions built into it and sort of how they are formulated in missions and how they actually get sort of implemented, I guess, in a reality, and then to understand, okay, where are these contradictions, which then sort of helps increase self-determination when those are dissolved. Am I following along?
So,
I'm trying.
Yeah, so sort of two things. So one, these policies, we should think about them very carefully because they have lots of weird effects.
Okay.
And one of the effects can be to increase or decrease epistemic self-determination, which I'm arguing separately, just a good, because people want to be able to pursue group projects like playing soccer. But also, by having epistemic self-determination, communities can better look at policies and decide, are these policies reflecting their values? Are they embedding what's important to them, or are they working against what's important to them? Thinking about like levels of pollution, for example. It's kind of, it can be a virtuous cycle.
Yes.
Or it can be a vicious cycle where, where poor policies impact communities' abilities to notice even worse policies coming down the pipeline, or good policies can increase communities' ability to push for and recognize better policies and to fight off bad policies.
I like this because this sort of, I guess, like, puts one value in front of us, right? Let's focus on this. How do we understand how it increases or decreases? And here, then you would see the interaction between sort of more the community-based approach, like focus sort of approaches, versus the systems sort of focus approaches, where, okay, how do we deal with these negative consequences that might not be made explicit, right? But that very much impact the community-focused sort of approach in certain ways, by just looking and making concrete this one value of self-determination, I guess, epistemic self-determination. So yeah, no, that's very helpful to sort of further digest, I guess, these different sub-movements.
And maybe it'd be helpful to, if you'd like, I can name a couple of sort of specific examples of what I'm talking about policies that help or don't help epistemic self-determination. So, so one example, we've talked about food dumping, so I won't spend too much time on that one, but that's obviously a big example, because when you dump a whole bunch of wheat in a country that has a million different uses for corn, not only are you forcing farmers off the ground, but you're also impacting people's sort of epistemic systems they have around preparing food. But let me look instead at the food pyramid of the United States. So this is an easy to read map of how to eat healthily, right? So there have been lots of critiques of it over the years, and it's changed. It's not a pyramid anymore. Now it's my food plate and whatever. One of the critiques of it, of course, is back to that idea of mixed goals for the federal government, because it put dairy very centrally in that pyramid, or quite close to the base, mostly just because of lobbying from the dairy industry, right? And the most basic one is wheat and carbohydrates, which some people think, well, we shouldn't be eating as much wheat as possible. So there's various critiques you can make nutritionally, or in political justice, whose money influence that, what kind of lobbying efforts went into the construction of that. But another critique you can make is what it does to epistemic self-determination. So when you're giving kids a food chart like that, and it says you ought to eat a lot of dairy, if you're giving it to immigrant communities that statistically have much lower ability to tolerate dairy products than average for Western European white people in the United States, you are, to the extent that you're convincing people to do that, and you're using it to inform what lunches kids are eating, and in a free and reduced lunch program, what breakfast they get, maybe even what dinners they get, what food is being handed out to them, you are impacting people's ability to advocate for their own community's foods, right? For the food culture and food ways that they brought with them as marginalized immigrant communities into the United States. You're making it harder for them to tell their kids that they ought to eat it, to know that it's good food, because here they are in this new country and they're hearing from experts that it's not good food, right? They ought to be eating the SAD, the standard American diet, or they ought to be eating that instead. And so it's hurting their ability to know what food is good or bad for their children, right? To be confident.
Yeah.
And, so I've written in other places that, when you undermine people's confidence in things that they know, you're actually undermining their knowledge, because if you're not sure about it anymore, you don't really know it. Now you just kind of think it, and then, we're continuing to reduce down. So that's kind of a problem. Some of the, I was talking before about the way that WIC programs and other free food programs in the United States try to slip in health education for pregnant women and for children, because we like to police people a whole lot. My wife, in fact, was on WIC when she was pregnant with her first child, and I remember the Q&A form, the frequently asked questions form that they gave her as part of the food, which she had to read it and sign it. This is not like an optional informational thing. This is part of the food program. And one of the questions was, can I drink alcohol while pregnant? And the answer was no, you can't. There has never been a study showing that it is safe to have alcohol while pregnant. So notice that it says that no study has shown that it's safe. Then a little bit farther, they didn't put them right next to each other because that would be a little too egregious, I think. But farther down the same FAQ, it says, can I eat fish? I've heard that eating fish is bad if you're pregnant because of mercury levels. And it says, it's fine. There has been no study showing that there is a strong risk to your baby, to the fetus, it ought to say, from eating commercially farmed fish and commercially caught fish at normal levels. So the first time it said there's no study showing that it's safe, which is one standard of proof. The other one is saying there's no study showing that there's a strong risk, which is a completely different burden of proof, right? Anybody, God, you couldn't get out of a critical thinking class that I taught as an undergrad. I would not allow you to graduate if you didn't see that those are very different standards of proof. But when that's the FAQ that you have to read and sign to show that you're becoming educated, when experts are putting this forward, that might not represent the values in your community, right? Maybe your community says, you know what, like one glass of wine isn't a big deal because our standard of proof is not that high for that. On the other hand, our standard of proof for fishing, because we aren't responsive to fishing lobby groups, their money, our standard is different for mercury poisoning. The mercury seems really frightening to me for children. And so our community would like to take a precautionary principle. And until you can show that it's safe, we don't want to do that, right? So, so those kinds of things, by purporting to be the answer, are undermining people's ability to do it, as opposed to, you could imagine a policy that had conversations and helped people build their own sorts of values, ask people what their values are, communally help them generate their values as a group, and then use that and have that reflected and say, well, if those are your values, then these are the kind of questions you would want to ask, and help them build their own kinds of policies. And there are some good stuff like that. Food policy councils, as I was saying, are a really good example of things that reinforce people's empirical sort of abilities. To an extent, labeling can also do that. Depending on how transparent it is, on how it works. Farm visits, farmers markets where you can talk to people, all those kinds of things can actually build up people's ability to understand communally what as a community, our values are, intersubjectively what my values are, and how we can, given those values, build knowledge around what's important to us.
No, this is really helpful, and then maybe changing the topics a bit. So we've been talking for around 1.5 hours, 2 hours so far, and it's been a great conversation. And I would love to continue, but I would also like to mention that you've been having a lot more of these type of conversations with other experts in food and food studies. So you've been running the podcast, and let me mention it, like titled "Thought About Food." So could you maybe just tell me a bit more about your sort of podcast journey? Like, obviously, we've been discussing local food and all sorts of aspects of it. What has this podcast been about? Like, which directions does it go?
Sure. Yeah. So the podcast was started during quarantine because I was trapped, and my children and wife were tired of me sitting them down and saying, well, but have you thought about the social epistemic value of the food that we're purchasing? They don't want to have that conversation too many times a day with me. So to kind of replicate the good conversations I can have at conferences and talking to people, I started it up. Initially, the first few people I'm talking to are just friends of mine. But since then, the point of the podcast, Thought About Food, is to talk to academics, activists, policymakers, but also chefs, anyone who interacts with food and thinks about it in sort of this deeper level. As I was saying, I think that the real interesting thing about food for me, why food is so interesting, is that it touches on everything. In order to really understand it, you have to know every branch of philosophy, but also biology, nutritional science, history, sociology, like name a field, right? And food is deeply implicated in it. But also it becomes what Starr and Korsmeyer have called a boundary object, which is that everyone can talk about it, right? Okay. So I have a very different background than some of the guests that I talk to on my podcast. I'm a philosopher. I mean, again, as I said, I started with a bunch of philosophy buddies of mine, but some of the people I talk to are activists, policymakers, scientists. But we can all talk about food because food is a part of all of our lives. We all eat and we all have opinions about food. Yeah. And so we can use that boundary object, that thing that we share in common, to sort of as a reference point to understand one another and our own areas of expertise. I also teach a class on philosophy of food. And it's really one of my favorite classes to teach because students, much more so than when you're teaching like metaphysics, and you're like, I don't know, what do you think about numbers? Are numbers real? Students don't know what to do with that. Hopefully I wouldn't ask it that way. I would do a better job teaching. But when you're talking about food, people all have really strong opinions already, right? Mm-hmm. And they all have thoughts and knowledge that they consider to be valuable. Whereas we've taught our students, unfortunately, I think, to think that what they heard at home isn't necessarily valuable in an academic context when talking about ethics even, right? They're a little nervous to bring forward what their grandmother said, or they think like, well, maybe that's not as good. But man, my grandmother's pancakes are the best is a thing that all my students will happily fight for. They'll fight for their grandmother's knowledge and wisdom and perspectives about food. And so it's a way to sort of find a connection. That's one thing boundary objects do. And to use that as like one point as we build a network between our different expertises and have these kind of interesting conversations. So the podcast is just a way to talk about food and to use food to think about everything else.
No, that's great. And so, to everyone listening, I will obviously put this on the top of the description so you can find it there. But yeah, I definitely recommend checking it out. And then maybe a new question that, I came up with right before this podcast because I thought, this could be interesting, would be the question, right? Like mention, one or several of your favorite food books, that people should be reading. So, we can all join this sort of project in thinking about it for ourselves. So yeah, that's my question.
Yeah, sure. Interesting. So I would suggest maybe it's a good place to start some of the books by Paul Thompson. Okay. So he is one of the early people to take food seriously and to take agriculture seriously. So he at first was talking about how environmental philosophy too often thought just about like wilderness, about, national parks and a wolf howling on a mountain, that kind of thing. But that we ought to instead think about farms as agricultural things, as environments, use the tools of environmental philosophy to think through it. So that was kind of an early project of his. And, all of that still continues through, but he's thought about food in lots of ways. And he does a really good job of not missing the productive aspects of food, of not slipping into thinking of food as just something that I eat, but rather as part of who we are as a society. So his work on sustainability and all these things kind of fall out of it. So a really accessible book, if people are nervous about philosophy, and if I've been talking too fast and using big words and being confusing, is a fair critique of how I talk. I would suggest From Field to Fork, which is a book that he wrote it's all of the philosophy in it is great if you are a philosopher, but it's written in a very accessible way. But some of his other books like The Spirit of the Soil, The Agrarian Vision, these sorts of everything really. He just came out with a book whose name I'm blanking on, that is thinking about the future of where where food production is going to go,
Mm.
right? So as technology increases, there's different kinds of models facing us, right? Should we try to maximize local food? That's one of the models that he discusses, which has some advantages and disadvantages. Should we try to use a high-tech sort of lots and lots of technical kind of gewgaws and, drones and all those kinds of things in order to have things that look like farms? Or should we be just trying to pursue nutrition above all else and trying to maximize food production? That all of these different conversations are sort of implicitly happening right now. And people aren't stepping back and looking at it. One thing that Paul's really good at as a philosopher is like having people notice that there's things are pulling us forward into the future, but there are different horses pulling us in slightly different directions. And we might want to pick one rather than getting, ripped apart. So, I'll think of the name of that and send it to you, and you can put it in the notes, because it is his newest work. But I think that kind of that sort of work, I think, is really important for us to do when we're thinking about food. So that's all very good. On the other hand, my favorite cookbook easily is Veganomicon by Isa Chandra Moskowitz, which if you're not vegan, but you'd like to cook vegan food, I suggest that one. Great. Also, she has a book called Isa Does It, which is even easier. I think that cooking is really important in that sense. So, a little bit on the academic nerd side, but then make yourself something delicious afterwards, to eat while you're reading it.
No, that's the perfect combo. And then as a final question, looking towards the future, like, in your view, what are sort of the exciting research directions for the philosophy of food, or just food studies more broadly? Some of the questions that you might be thinking about, or just some of the questions you think everyone should be thinking about?
Sure. So, at a, bird's eye view, 30,000 foot level kind of view of it, I think it's, what I was saying before, that because food touches on so many different things, right? I think food is sort of interwoven into what it is to be human. That I look forward to increasing sort of inter-academic, interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary kind of work. I look forward to increasingly activists and people who are practically working on food, be they farmers or whatever, getting brought into and having their expertise respected, and having that, in sort of genuinely productive ways. I edited a book on local food with Zachary Paiso, and we had activists and academics kind of having conversations together, and in the back then had contact information so that people could hopefully continue those sorts of conversations. So I look forward to building those kinds of things in real ways. Not in the sense of look forward to, but I predict that as climate change continues to worsen, as poverty continues, on the global scale, presumably to worsen, at least for certain marginalized groups, that food is going to become increasingly an issue again. I mean, the history of humanity has been the history of food riots. As that tension I was talking about prices of food, putting somebody out in true risk of their lives and their ability to provide for their children. And so you're going to have those, right? All of the first riots in the United States were about food. I'm Irish American. The history of Ireland is history of food riots, right? It's a common thing, and we've managed to kick the can down the road with technological inputs, and particularly fossil fuel inputs into food. And as that becomes more difficult, or as food becomes less predictive, and by the way, another thing I've written about with epistemic self-determination, as climate change makes weather less predictable, you're harming farmers' ability to have epistemic self-determination, to be able to plan how they're going to produce food, because they can't predict how the weather's going to be. So we're going to see lots more problems in that sense, and hopefully food studies can intervene in helpful ways. Food studies broadly defined. There's an interesting documentary called The Power of Community, which is about how Cuba responded to peak oil early, because when the Soviet Union collapsed, they stopped having oil inputs. And so their high fossil fuel input agricultural model that they'd gotten from the Soviet Union, they had to sort of reinvent and start producing local food. And now, the city of Havana grows something like 80% of its own food within the city's borders. And that was, they sort of had to, in advance, go through it. We'll all have to go through at some point. So it's a good documentary to check out. So in that sense, not look forward to, but I predict those kinds of problems. And then in my own work, a couple areas that I've been working on recently, I've been looking a lot at precision farming, precision livestock farming. This is using technology to replicate what people see as an important good of, the farmer, your image of this good farmer who has like 6 cows and he knows their names and he talks to them every morning and he knows, oh, this one favors her left foot and this one likes a little more clover in her hay, that kind of thing. That's impossible at scale. So we'll do it with technology. And so people are using all kinds of technological surveillance stuff like facial recognition, biometric reading in order to be like a conscientious farmer. And I think that's really interesting, which I always tell my students, I use the word interesting the way they would use the word sad or disturbing or depressing. So I think it's very interesting. I could probably write about it, but it's probably bad in the sense that it normalizes and provides funds for surveillance research, but also to the extent that I don't think it actually does replicate what we take to be farmers' moral duties to their animals. I think that it has lots of sorts of problems. So I've been working on that. And I've been thinking about sort of like how high tech stuff like that is pulling on, maybe subverting a lot of the back to the land kind of narratives that that we have at the same time.
No, that's interesting. So, Professor Werkheiser, thank you so much for being on the podcast. We really appreciate the conversation. Do you have any parting words to the audience?
No, not at all. Just that, thank you so much for this. I've really enjoyed this conversation, and the other episodes of your show that I've been watching have been really, really good. So if you somehow, I can't imagine that anyone found this because they're interested in me and not you. But if by some random chance, I guess like a cousin of mine watched this because they saw me, I would encourage them to go watch the rest of your programs.